Tac. So, bonjour. I will do a short introduction in both French and English. Bienvenue à cette dernière journée du MAH, Media Art History, qui a été un événement passionnant. Et donc ce matin, il reste différentes présentations et nous ferons une synthèse par après. Donc je suis André Éric LETOURNEAU. My name is André Éric LETOURNEAU. I'm a professor here at Université du Québec à Montréal at École des Médias. So this morning, a panel is named Practices Differential Sites, and we're welcoming from Japan Jung-Yeon Ma. Sorry, my pronunciation is not perfect. Jason Lewis from Concordia University. Young is from Tokyo University of the Arts. Dr. Solvita ZARINA from University of Latvia, and Mr. Darko FRITZ from Zagreb, Croatia. So I will briefly introduce each of you before your presentation, and then we will have a discussion with the audience. So Jung-Yeon Ma, maybe this is better. I'm getting better each time, I hope. You're a researcher. You've been publishing a very important book about media art in Japan, named A Critical History of Media Art in Japan, published last year by Artes. You are, here's the book, you are a visiting scholar in 2 institutions, Tokyo University of the Arts and at the National Art Center in Tokyo. And you will present us today a general overview of your book and your research about media arts in Japan.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming in such an early time on Sunday morning. Not many, but maybe some of you may remember me, my presentation 4 years ago, which was held in Liverpool, in the Rewire. At that time, I presented about my PhD thesis, which was, my book is based on the PhD thesis. And the title was A Superficial History of Media Art in Japan. Yes, it is very negative title. And at that time, I myself didn't quite understand conscious about the fact. But now I understand better because it was the year of 2011 when the big earthquake and tsunami has come. And it was very hard time for everybody, but it was a very hard time for foreigners in a different way, including myself, who decided to live in and work in Japan at that time. So there's a kind of distance between the society of Japan and myself living in Japan. So maybe I felt I couldn't understand the essence of the things going on and the history of media art in Japan at that time. But so the publication was decided right after my graduation, but it was paused for 2 years and resumed in last year, and it was published in December last year. And I was honestly very surprised to see that this book was so much welcomed by everybody. I shouldn't say everybody, so many people. So today I will try to give you a hint of the general overview of the history of media art in Japan. And before I begin, I should answer the most questions are asked by people. Why Japan? And I always say, it was the same question when I was asked in the Japanese embassy in 2007 for studying Japan. And I said, just simply because the artist I'm interested in is Japanese, not because I'm interested in Japan. But in 2014, last year, the artist who became my professor, Masaki Fujita, asked me the same question. And this time I answered in a plural form. I'm interested in the artists whom I'm interested in are Japanese, that's why. And everything began from 2004, when I first met him with his work, field work at Arsas in 2004. At that time, I couldn't speak in Japanese. Anyway, so when I came to Japan, the word media art was not popular. When I visited the IAMAS, it was surprising because students say, oh, there's no media artist in this school. And the artists try to call themselves as artists rather than media artists. So I was not the one who know most about the history, but I was the one who was most desperate to understand the history. Maybe that's why I could write this book. So there's many ways to access the history, and I chose one. And the book was very welcomed, maybe because it was not limited to the history of media art. Ironically, it was not limited to the art history. So that's why the sociologists and other people welcomed this book and found it interesting. And the book ends in 2007 when I went to Japan. Because I went to, since then, I'm one of them inside of the society, so that's why I stopped there. I should make a different strategy to make a different perspective to write the history since then. So the story begins in the early 60s. If I focus on the artists and artworks, I should go back to 1950s, such as experimental workshop. But I didn't, because I tried to focus what was there, the background and the stage of where artists played their roles. And this work, interesting film, was shown in the Osaka Expo. Every pavilions used the multi-screen, but probably this is the only one which has the right reason to use that. It was a bicycle pavilion. And right after that, artists found they are very close in the art society. So that's why they were get interested in the videos. And I slightly go back to the 60s and mentioned about, make a comparison between the early experiments in computer art in the 60s and later in the 80s. I wish I had more time to show each works. And in the 60s, where is the place where the computer is located was important for them. But in the 80s, why they want to use that was much more important for them. And because in the 80s, there was a economic competition between Japan and US, and it influenced some rights about Japanese industries, and that changed certain ideas. There were ideas about being Japanese artists when they go out overseas, and this part is some written from some perspective from sociologists. And then it goes to try to connect the experiments in the 80s and 90s. And there was a small group. The key person was Katsuhiro Yamaguchi, who was the member of experimental workshop in the 1950s. And he made a group named Arjunis. It's an artists and engineers and designers and the people who work for the electronic companies. They made a series exhibitions named High Technology Art exhibitions, and that was the prehistory. And a local newspaper company in Nagoya, there was a director has a very good insight about art. He asked them to join them, and since the Osaka Expo, there was many expos have been the place for artists to present their works. And Artec began with the International Vienna International Expo Design Expo in 1989. Then it evolved into Art Biennale gradually. And surprisingly, the history of Artec has been forgotten. And later I will show you some materials I found. Let me just go back to this one. This is not the first holography art in Japan, but definitely the first holography installation. According to Itsuo Sakane, holography got very popular when it was introduced in Okinawa Expo in 1975. And right after that, artists tried to make an experiment with holographies. And Setsuko Ishii, she was interested in holography because it is not the real image or a reflection. So for her, it was the third image. So she thought she shouldn't display the holography itself as like a photography. So she tried to make an installation, make a comparison among these three different images. And it was her first work. And it was very important, but now she's just known as a holography artist. Then I found it's a great shame. She's an artist. And I should skip for the interesting story about the big failure of this work in Artec, because it was a pavilion, not the museum. So many people are gathering, and they shouldn't be quiet. You know, it's a different circumstances. So what the artist Miyajima Tatsuo wanted is the viewer go into the circle and make contemplation, but it's not that kind of a situation. So he was very mad at the way people controlled the viewers. Later you can see the very different atmosphere from the videos. Oh dear. I expected. And here, finally, we arrived in the 90s. So these are the legendary names we know about it. And as for ICC, I just wrote about the preliminary activities rather than what they have done since the opening. These are the works. We should look more carefully, in fact. And because it's it's not that long history, but it's a history at least 20 years. So there is a kind of interesting, we can make up interesting comparisons about between the exhibitions or the works. For example, Seiko Mikami, she made eye tracking experiments in the 90s at the Canon Art Lab. And she made it again in UQAM. in a different version. And the book ends with the expansions in educations. And it can go quite further. It's until 60s about the interdisciplinary educations between the arts and technologies. It has its own history. Now the question is the research and creation in the university is a new, for them it's a new theme for their activities. I wish I had the time for this. And so as a second part of my presentation, I should go back to the Artec. I was very surprised when I found this. But the people said I was lucky because these boxes were used to in the kind of warehouse for since the 1997, and it has just come back to the museum, but not in the right place. So I was the first one who opened the boxes and tried to make an understand. There are lots of interesting things, but let me just show some videos. Quickly.
名古屋市内のホテルで名古屋国際ビエンナーレ開催協議会設立
This is Katsuhiro Yamaguchi.
アーテック大賞に輝き総額1600万円の賞金が贈られたのです。こ
You
の後
can
行われた
recognize
パーティーで
Frank
世
Popper,
界中から集まった作家関係者の交流がより深く
Jeffrey Shaw. Chris mentioned the disappointing about
カトリーヌ・ガン
the materials of videos, not the black and white pictures.
画家として
Honestly, I was
写真家として活動して
very
きた彼女は
disappointed to see the videos of Artec
ビデオアーティストとして
because
活動を始
it
めた
doesn't look very good for us. Maybe after 50 years, it will look very great, but not now. It's that's the most difficult thing for us to
これまでにも多数回答
describe the histories. And the other problem is the videos taken by artists or the institutions are not as good as TV program. So sometimes we have to depend on the TV programs, which is just awful.
いいんじゃないかななんて思っております。恋人同士とお客さんがね。なんでしょう。
And she does not understand what's going on. And she doesn't even know the name. And she keeps saying, we don't have time for it, but later she make a very long time. She uses time for some games and auctions or presents. But it's sad but true. We have to depend on these kind of materials to understand the clues, to get the clues, because the private collections are usually not as good as the TV's materials. Okay. And Artec is very interesting because it was the two parts, international commissioned exhibition and domestic competition, and students had a part, can send their works to the second part. And the most interesting thing I found is a perspective presented by International Directors Group. You can see the names. And this never happened since then. Now, every local governments have biennales and triennales in Japan toward the 2020, the Tokyo Olympic. I don't know how many will remain after that. But there is no foreign directors. Artists and curators are invited, but no foreign directors. But Artec was the only, probably one of the how can I say, very rare case to try to show the international context, not in the domestic context. maybe that's why the Nagoya could hold ISEA in 2002. After that, it was the first ISEA held in Asia. It must be very difficult, I understand. So, as we can see, Arte questions about the documentation of media arts and the exhibition environment of media art, just like Miyajima Tacho's case. And there are two more examples I will just quickly show. Among these names, I found Yasia Reinhardt, who is the honorary board of media art histories. She was the only one who took part in, who committed in art tech for 10 years. So I was interested in her and her commitment to history of media art in Japan. So I visited her and researched on her since 2012. And the result was this symposia held in 2 parts, which was held in last month, October. So I asked her to show her exhibitions she curated in ICA. The last one was not realized, that's why 5.5 exhibitions. And there are 2 exhibitions featured in this symposia. One is Fluorescent Chrysanthemum, introducing contemporary Japanese art, film, animation, and music. And the other one is the most the famous one, but everybody knows about this exhibition's name, but there are not many people who can explain in detail. So I asked her to make a long presentation, and I will make it into documentation in both in English and Japanese. So this was her first visit in 1967, and this was the last one with my colleagues. And the last project I want to introduce is the. So
I just see that we almost reached 20 minutes.
Oh,
so
sorry.
Can you?
So
This is a fascinating presentation.
No,
but,
sorry.
Unfortunately, we have to.
So I'm not an archivist. I'm a researcher. So I don't know. I don't make archive, but I just want to find a way I can commit to the archives. So symposiums or exhibitions. So apparently we don't have enough time for this, but let me just show you the very small exhibition held in Tokyo on Seiko Mikame's 1980s. There are flyers I want to present to you. And maybe next time, we are working on Ichio Sakane's works. So maybe next time I and my colleagues will make another presentation about him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jung-Yeon. So later we will come back to this with the period of questions. Thank you very much. Jason Lewis is a professor at Concordia University and a researcher at Zagreb. He is directing OBX Labs. It's a research group which produces digital art projects with various indigenous communities. He's also co-directing AppTech, Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, a network of artists, programmers, and academics who explore indigenous spaces and territories on the internet, in online games and in virtual environments. He's been directing workshops in various schools and institutions where he teaches students to create their own video games involving indigenous traditions. And he's also a writer and a poet and present his work in different forms involving digital poetry and digital technologies. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you very much, Eric. And thank you to Chris and Giselle and the organizers for inviting me here, and the volunteers and the great staff. And I'd also like to thank Mikel Peru, who unfortunately was supposed to give a talk on Wednesday, but was ill, but he did some of the background research for what I'm going to talk about today. And of course, my partner Skabanari, who is integral to all my thinking about what I'm going to talk about. So my talk, yeah, it's up there. A brief media history of the Indigenous future. So Skawanati covered a significant chapter of that history in her keynote yesterday. So I'm going to change the focus a little bit and use this as an opportunity to present to this audience the concept of the future imaginary that I've been developing in conversation with Skawanati and others over the last couple of years. So let's start with a preliminary definition. The concept of the future imaginary seeks to capture the ways people imagine the futures of their societies. In Indigenous contexts, we often refer to the seventh generation as a shorthand reminder to keep in mind how our actions in the present will affect our descendants. So we've taken that frame, 150 to 200 years out, as the future we are interested in thinking about, science fiction territory. So the question is, what do we think about when we think in those time frames? As I've argued elsewhere, what is ready to hand are the images and ideas generated over decades of popular science fiction. This has filled our heads with ideas about what kind of governmental structures we might have, what sorts of rituals we might practice, what kind of gender structures might be in place, what kind of drugs we might take, and of course, what kind of technology we might be using. You can think of the future imaginary as a distinct part of the current social imaginary, described by Charles Taylor as the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings, not expressed in theoretical terms, but carried in images, stories, and legends. It forms the popular vocabulary that we use to describe what we see when we see the future. Given that popular science fiction has historically, though not totally, been the provenance of Western writers, it tends to reflect a particular set of imperial and colonial biases and prejudices. Skawanati pointed out one of the consequences of this lineage, the fact that recognizable descendants of Indigenous people did not appear in the settler future imaginary, nor does one see any indication of Indigenous cultures as having survived into the seventh generation and beyond. Despite this, we love science fiction. It allows us to dream concretely about what the future might hold for our children, our communities, and our species. The work we conduct with the Aboriginal territories in Cyberspace has been focused on claiming territory in the newly forming virtual spaces. Now we are interested in claiming territory in the future imaginary, or better yet, creating our own. Indigenous artwork that explicitly engages with the technologized future are not many. There's Skawanati's own work, of course, including Imagining Indians in the 25th Century and Time Traveler. She spoke about both yesterday, and much has been written about them. So tempting as it is, and as much as I love the works, and I believe they are centrally important, I won't dwell on them here. Mi'kmaq filmmaker Jeff Barnaby brings dystopic visual tropes from both 1984 and Blade Runner into his short film, File Under Miscellaneous, from 2010. It tells of the moment a Mi'kmaq man, sick of being a man, chooses to undergo a grisly medical transformation to strip him of his native skin so he can become white, with the interesting implication that, as such, he is no longer a man. Another film, Nanabah Becker's The Sixth World, came out a year later. Becker, who's Diné Navajo, draws on Navajo origin stories that hold that our world, Earth, is the fifth world. Becker explores the idea that the next world, the sixth world, would actually come into being by colonizing Mars, and imagines how Navajo traditional agricultural knowledge would save the Martian colony. We recently discovered the work of the artist Solomon Enos. His Polyfantastica is an epic spanning 6,000 years of alternate history and alternate futures. It's crazy, actually. Like, you got to go check this guy's work out. It's just amazing what he's done. He's drawing upon and radically expanding Native Hawaiian mythology. The humans and creatures and worlds of this story open up vast new possibilities for thinking about how Native communities might evolve. The work by these four artists, Skawanati, Barnaby, Becker, and Enos, manifests the future. A second path to the future imaginary is to hybridize the present in new or extreme ways. Lawrence Paul Yaxwell-Lupton's seminal work, Inherent Rights, Vision Rights, is the first new media example of this approach. This pioneering virtuality piece was produced in the Art and Virtual Environments residency at Banff in 1994, and it creates a virtual West Coast longhouse that draws the viewer into Yuxwalupton Salish traditions while simultaneously casting them into the future through its neon bright representations. The OG Cree artist Casey Adams created the Cyborg Hybrid series in the mid-2000s. As a speculative intervention into, to quote Mohawk curator Steve Loft, a wholly different perspective on our possible future. She seeks to inhabit the world of the trans-biological and of manufactured idols with a radical indigeneity. In 2010, Wendy Redstar from the Crow Nation created Thunder Up Above, a photo series that integrates futuristic regalia with interplanetary landscapes to create tableaus which suggest an entirely different mythology of contact. A third path to the future imaginary is to imagine alternative paths that then lead to different futures. This strategy has been most richly mined in literature. I recommend Anishinaabe scholar Grace Dillon's discussion of slipstreaming in Walking the Clouds, her anthology of indigenous science fiction. But we do see this in media arts, with one of the most significant examples being Cree multimedia artist Archer Pachawas' Horse. In this digital drum performance, Pachawas imagines what would have happened if, during the Americans' decades-long assault on the Indians of the Plains, the horses from both sides had joined together to intervene and force a peace. A fourth path to Indigenous future imaginaries is by engaging with digital media and digital culture. As our present becomes increasingly saturated with technology, it's fairly certain that our future will be as well. Creatively engaging with technology and the culture that enables it is itself an act of imagination. This is one of the primary motivations behind the Skins workshops on Aboriginal storytelling and video game design, which provides youth both the tools to build the future and the attitude that they will have a place in it. This work has been done other places as well. The Drumbeats to Drumbites think tank held at the Banff Center in 1994, same year as Inherent Rights, Vision Rights, it's worth noting, brought together a number of Indigenous artists to discuss electronic networks for media collaboration and production. The Skinning Our Tools Designing for Culture and Context Summit held in Banff almost a decade later in 2003 provided opportunities for Indigenous artists and technologists to think deeply about how to repurpose digital technology to better suit the needs of our communities, giving rise to ideas such as Cree++, an Indigenous programming language. It was also the site of the first conversations about what would, 5 years later, become the Skins workshops, right? She wasn't listening. She wasn't listening to me. And the final fifth path, to the future imaginary, the final path for the moment, anyways, or maybe, we'll see, to the future imaginary is through writing about our engagements with technology. Key volumes here include Transference, Tradition, Technology, Native New Media Exploring Visual and Digital Culture from 2006, which seeks to situate Aboriginal new media within an older lineage of Indigenous video, performance, and visual arts. Two essays of particular note in this collection are Cree Métis media theorist Ahasu Maskigan Iskewu Drumbeats to Drumbites, Globalizing Networked Aboriginal Art, and Métis Cree filmmaker Loretta Todd's Aboriginal Narrative in Cyberspace, which I just noticed when I was preparing this talk, the title piece in the book is actually wrong. It just says Narratives in Cyberspace. So, a second reference is volume 17 of Banff's online magazine of Canadian digital art and culture called Horizon Zero. This volume, titled Tell, Aboriginal Story in Digital Media, was published in 2004. I would recommend that you read, at the very least, curator Candace Hopkins' Making Things Our Own, the Indigenous Aesthetic in Digital Storytelling. And the third academic reference is Coded Territories, Indigenous Pathways in New Media, published just last year, which describes and discusses a range of digital media practices by contemporary Indigenous creators. Archer Pachawas' essay, Indigenism, Aboriginal Worldview as Global Protocol, is a good place to start in that collection. And I have two essays developing the idea of the future imaginary from an Indigenous perspective. A Better Dance and Better Prayers, Systems, Structures, and the Future Imaginary and Aboriginal Media in the Coded Territories collection, and Preparations for a Haunting, Notes Towards an Indigenous Future Imaginary, in an upcoming volume called The Participatory Condition. So, I've sketched 5 paths to an Indigenous future imaginary. This is thinking very much under development, so I'm interested in people's comments and critiques. Manifesting the future, hybridizing the present, altering the past, shaping the infrastructure, and critiquing the project. So now, Eric, how much time do I have? Okay. Okay. So, being here at this conference has made me think of yet another permutation. These things have sort of been stewing in one form or another for a while, but for a long time I wished that there was more connections between the international media art world, which I had entered as a young new media technology researcher in Silicon Valley in the early 90s, and became more familiar with through my involvement with the Banff New Media Institute in particular, and the Indigenous media art world in which I became enmeshed after the turn of the century as I started my collaborations with Skawanati. I felt that there were Indigenous new media artists whose work was as strong as that found on the international scene, and I thought the international scene would be greatly enriched by actually being international rather than so tenaciously Euro and American-centric. These connections, though, remain thin. This conference hosting notable exceptions. And now I find myself appreciating that separation. It's a feature, not a bug. I can see how, if we had been more integrated, it's quite possible that Indigenous practice would have been a minority practice within a larger existing narrative. A few lonely examples within an existing canon, subaltern subject to established theory. The way it has gone over the last 2 decades, though, is that we've developed our own critics, our own critical frameworks, our own antecedents, our own canon. The works and artists and critics I've referenced today are just a small sample. It meant that we've not been preoccupied with getting added in or brought in to the narrative, to the canon, to the theory. And it struck me that this in itself is an exercise in imagining an alternative Indigenous future. It has allowed us to center our practice in the discourse which frames it and create a distinct future where we, not dependent on the gatekeepers to open the gates, not required even to storm the gates or even go around them, it has allowed us to create a distinct future in which we've struck out on our own into new territory. So to close, let me augment, hope it's okay with you, I actually didn't ask, it was okay. I wanted to augment Skawanai's answer to a question posed to her yesterday. I think it was Sarah Diamond who asked, what sort of future paths have the youth generated? And I'd like to tack a coda onto Skawanai's response. Last year, I gave a public talk for which we commissioned 7 Indigenous artists to imagine their descendants or community 7 generations from now. Here's a sample of what they came up with. So this is Tommy Deere, who's Mohawk from Skawanati's community, who is, among many things, he's a comic book artist. Imagining, for him, it was about imagining the longhouse surviving into the future and remaining true to Iroquois tradition. Stephen Sanderson's Plains Cree, imagining his people once again in command of the plains. Inuit artist Heather Campbell, who actually had probably one of the grimmer takes on it, even though the image doesn't look that grim, but she was imagining that by that time the sea levels will have risen quite considerably, and that her people would have to figure out new ways of living and probably have to move actually from where they are now. Jeffrey Virege, Scallum from the West Coast, who was like, I always wanted to think about and imagine being a spaceman and getting some skins out in space. And then Guy Denora Bush, Mohawk, also from Ganawage, who wanted to sort of represent, similar to Tommy, what it would mean to continue and keep their traditions as we went into space in particular. So the extraordinary thing about the series to me is how eager most of the participants were to take on this challenge. So I'll let the final word of this talk to go to one of the artists, Guy Denora Bush, who wrote the following about her contribution. The girls in the drawing are some of my students. I was thinking about the role social media and personal devices will play in young people's lives and how this might change their futures. And of course, as you said, the importance of preserving our traditions and practices. Initially, my outlook on the future of Indigenous people was bleak. We spend every day fighting for tomorrow. It was difficult for me to imagine something beyond 50 years, but doing this work made me realize that we can build a kind future for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason Lewis. The next speaker is Dr. Solvita ZARINA. Dr. ZARINA is an artist. She's a senior researcher at the Institute of Mathematics and Computer Science, the University of Latvia, LETOURNEAU. She holds a position of assistant professor at the Faculty of Computing of the University of Latvia. Dr. ZARINA graduated from the Painting Department, Art Academia of Latvia, and she holds a PhD from the Art Academy of Latvia. She has been employed as an associate professor at the Design School of Baltic International Academy, lecturer at the Banking Institution of Higher Education, Latvia. She has also delivered visiting lectures at the Tama University in Japan and Escola Superior de Artes e Design in Portugal. Her scientific and pedagogical interests include digital art, art and graphic design history, web and GUI design, GUI design. Maybe you can explain that later. And
user interface.
and information visualization. Sorry, still Sunday morning. Research interests also lie within the field of art and technology, media art history, and aesthetics. Recent publications can be found at the Proceedings of the Future of Art and Computing, a post-Turing centennial perspective, Goldsmith, London. So welcome, Dr. ZARINA.
Thank you very much for this long introduction. And this geographic coordinate system announces the exact place where the artworks I'm going to show came from. But putting Latvia and its capital Riga on the map on the media art field, one landmark needs to be added. Back in the 90s, two young artists, Rasa and Raitis Schmitz, together with Jānis Garanš, founded eLab. Founded eLab, electronic laboratory, and from the year 2000, it has been known as RIXI Center. And the previous Media Art History Conference in 2013 was hosted by RIXI Center, and here you can see recently published proceedings of this conference. And on behalf of editors Lev Manovic, Rasa and Raitis Schmitz, I would like to greet the participants of Recreate conference with these proceedings. But so far so good. In my presentation, I would like to cover two topics containing the prefix "re". First of all, I'll attempt to unearth some lesser-known artifacts from the 1970s, when a kind of ASCII art and computer music emerged in the academic circles of Latvian computer scientists. But in order to renew some rules of game in the ASCII art, I'm going to make small historical detour to cover some techniques and stylistic approaches in the field. And different characters, punctuation marks, digits, and technical symbols are most often used in ASCII art, and double printing for the darker areas was used as well. And this small detail you can see now is one of the first ASCII artwork ever done, and it Phillips Peterson's so-called Mona by numbers. And in this portrait, a French singer and songwriter, Georges Brassens, it is composed entirely of the computer characters M, W, O, and asterisk as well. But this famous Harmons and Knowlton's artwork, Studies in Perception, consists of technical symbols. It's one thing, and the other one, what serves as an input for the visual content of ASCII. Mostly they are photographs and printed images as well sometimes. But ASCII artworks can be abstract too. This one is done by professional Spanish artist Manuel Barbadillo. And now these case studies about ASCII art at the Computing Center, University of Latvia. The very first examples of computer drawings in Latvia can be found from the late 1960s. And it is connected with the fact that in 1969, a second-generation computer, GE 415, was bought from France to set it at the premises of the Computing Center in Riga. This was the first machine with an output device printing more than 20 symbols in one line. And engineers called it the wide print, platā druk in Latvian. Here you can see a photo of Jānis Daube. He and his team were responsible for the first computer in Latvia, built in 1962. And here is his ASCII portrait and a detail of it. Here we can see computer characters, computer technical symbols, as well as double print. But one can call it is as KOI art, not ASCII art, because it comes from Russian coding system, Kod обмена информацией, in English, Code for Information Exchange. And here the letter X stands for Russian sound H, and it is H in English and H in French. And here is the painstaking preparation process for ASCII art done by these engineers and computing center. Other portraits include head of the University of Latvia at that time, Visvaris Millers, and it is printed in 1977. And another stylistic approach, and chief accountant of this university, Jānis Kaugars. And here you can see the most popular of all of them, portrait of Asians Orange. At that time, he was the head of computing center. Here is a small detail of it. And here is a period photo from Orange's 60 years birthday party in 1971, depicted a simulated interactive printing of this portrait. As I said, his portrait luckily has gained popularity amidst the nowadays computer science and IT industry people in Latvia. In a web page dedicated to Asians Orange Award, his ASCII portrait serves as a logo for the whole event. But now back to the reality of 70s in Latvia. It is portrait of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and it is a digitalization from the Communist Party leader's portrait in the Kremlin Congress Palace, Moscow. And it was known from photos in newspapers. And here, another Lenin's portrait example from Eastern Germany. And following slides will reveal other stuff preserved. This one shows the Riga coat of arms from the Soviet time. Now it has changed back to historical one. ASCII from 1979 made in honor of University of Latvia anniversary, and greeting cards, mascots, etc. This one shows not Latvian example, but Russian one. And I have to admit that ASCII art was widespread at the computing centers in former Soviet Union. But this pioneering computer-generated animation film also was executed in ASCII. And besides that, it boasts with a realistic movement performance of a living creature. To achieve this goal, they created a hierarchical data structure which, with the help of different equation systems, describes the movement of a body. And they claim that this principle was employed roughly 10 years before its use in the West. However, due to political isolation, the film became known to a wider audience only after the collapse of USSR. And with this slide, I'm starting to show a little weird part, some kind of subversive information exchange between then divided Eastern and Western European engineers and scientists. Western computers arrived together with some demo programs welcomed by local staff. And they made local variations for them as well. Taking into account the political atmosphere at that time, we can call it as underground ASCII. And the last slide of this subtopic shows as a special stand made for ASCII series. Initially, it reveals Bikini Girl, but when opened in 2 steps, viewer can see as she undresses. But now to a little bit more serious conclusion for this part. The name ASCII art was completely unfamiliar in Latvia at that time. Nobody, including the authors of computer drawings, accepted them as art. They are not signed at all due to their completely different status in perception of society as well as the author's own position. Very few of them survived, despite they were made in computer centers not only in Latvia but also across Soviet Union. The most compelling artworks belong to the portrait genre. The features associated with formal portraits were most common. However, in some cases they portrayed colleagues, and it penetrates these works with more personal quality. Next topic will cover more up-to-date phenomena, but in order to build a bridge between the topics, I would like to show an artwork done by professional designer, artist, and theoretician Jānis Borgs. It should be taken into account that the art and science were 2 divided worlds at that time in Latvia, especially computer science, because of its connection with military commissions. And Jānis Borgs decided to act as if he had worked with computer. His tools were ink and paper, but authors' comments on the art creation process reveals that it was done in a similar way as programmed artworks were made by Hiroshi Kawano in Japan or Vera Molnar with her machine imaginaire technique in France. And this is nowadays photo with Jānis Borgs on the left side, together with whole set of his works. These are recently made artworks by Martin Schratniks. And Martin Schratniks is a designer, video and media artist, and at the same time he is responsible for Rikscenter communication and print design, including Renew conference proceedings shown at the beginning of this presentation. But Recently, he became interested in some kind of early computer art as a medium for his aesthetic ideas. His moving images are combined with soundtrack, which will not be present now. And this final view. On the one hand, these works literally resemble early computer art of Ben Lapowski, Michael Knowles, Herbert Frank, and other computer pioneers. But on the other hand, they are mentally closer to the pieces of algorists Roman Verostko and Jean-Pierre Baer. But the newest of his artworks plays across the topic of the random movement. And this piece is comprised in two parts, generative animation and digital drawing, done by artist himself, both of the parts, of course. And artist says that he wants to make both of these visual images indistinguishable, and he don't reveal which is which of them. And of course, besides the discussion about randomness, one can argue about the computer-generated and computer-assisted art and the role of these computer programs or these programs written by artists, and their difference and similarity as well. But maybe it's governed by the same silent passions that arise in a game of chess in which the final number of combinations is not known. That's all for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zarina, for this wonderful presentation. The next and the last lecture today is from Mr. Darko FRITZ, born in Croatia. He's an artist, independent curator and researcher and graphic designer, born in 1966, and currently lives and works in Amsterdam, Zagreb. And his work fills the gap between contemporary, I took that from your website, his work fills the gap between contemporary art practices and media art culture. His artworks make use of various materials and mediums: architectonic, organic, public transport, electronic, traditional art mediums, communication. In his artwork, he often uses electronic, communication, digital techniques, photocopies and slides, projection, film loops, video, digital photography, fax since 1991.
It's more me like
it's a long time ago.
But, well, I'm here wearing another hat.
And internet since 1994. His work is often organized in long-term projects, but he produces independent art objects as well. He published and edited several printed and electronic publications and portfolio of prints. He wrote the first overview of media art in Croatia since the 60s as editor for culturenet.hr web portal. So welcome, Darko FRITZ.
Thank you. I have a lot to say, so I'll just start straightforward. Several initiatives that had started exploring the relationship between art, science, and technology in the 1960s shifted their focus toward the use of digital technologies by the end of the decade. In the beginning of the 1960s, a majority of art practitioners shared an approach to machines that did not differentiate much between the mechanical and information process machines, as will be seen in the following discussions of the practices of both new tendencies and experiments in art and technology that will further referred as EAT. In the late 60s, digital art became the focus of several exhibitions and expanded theoretical discourse, which resulted in the creation of the new networks dedicated to digital arts. After a series of smaller exhibitions starting in the mid-60s, the first international group exhibition dedicated exclusively to digital arts was held in Brno, the Czech Republic, in February '68. Quite often overlooked fact. Happened in one socialistic country, funny enough. That show, as well the series of international group exhibitions on cybernetics and computer art that took place in the following year, were organized by major art institutions and present across Europe, United States, and Japan. This presence within the structures of cultural institutions fueled both the professional and mainstream imagination and created both an artistic trend and a certain hype surrounding imaginary futures that most radically present itself at the world fairs of a time, as we saw a few examples in the previous presentations. There suddenly seemed to be a necessary for international networks for digital arts that will transgress the exhibition format and fulfill the need for the networking on a regular rather than just occasional basis. Lacking their own networks, digital art practitioners originally participated in information technology ones and their annual conferences. EAT, as such, held presentation in '67 in annual meeting at IEEE, Institute of Electrical Electronic Engineers. IFIP, an umbrella organization for national societies working in the field of information processing, provided space for much needed international networking of the digital art community. An important meeting point was the '68 IFIP Congress in Edinburgh, where the Art Networks Computer Art Society UK and Netherlands were both initiated. Association for Computing Machinery, ACM, has been organizing an annual Computer Arts Festival since '68. SIGGRAPH, the special interest group in computer graphics and interactive techniques, is the annual conference on computer graphics convened by the ACM since '74. SIGGRAPH conferences have been held across the United States and attended by tens of thousands of computer professionals. SIGGRAPH had began their art exhibition with Computer Culture Art in 1981, presenting computer graphics, which developed into the Survey of Interactive and Robotic Art titled Machine Culture in '93. Next to the core focus on information technology, industry, and business, both IFIP and ACM SIGGRAPH held competitions and awards for digital arts that often focus more on the technical excellence than artistic and cultural achievements and developments of critical discourse. The critique of these mainstream IT industries and their lack of critical discourse and social awareness was common among the practitioners with a background in humanities, art, and culture. The different attitudes toward IT sector represented by the culture industry positions respectively became explicit in the ACM Counter Conference in Baudelaire that was held in parallel to the '71 National Conference of the ICM in Chicago. Anonymous comment in the Page Mag bulletin read, these two meetings will mark the climax in the campaign for social responsibility in the computer profession. Their repercussions will be felt for years to come, end quote. The critique came from the Computer Art Society, founded in London in '68, as the first society dedicated to digital arts. Over the next few years, Computer Art Society became the focus of computer arts activity in Britain, supporting practitioners through the network of meetings, conferences, code writing, workshops, social events, exhibitions, and occasionally founding. Computer Art Society published a news bulletin Page from 1968 79 to 85. By 1970, Computer Art Society had 377 members in 17 countries. The spin-off organization of Computer Art Society Holland was founded in 1970, and American branch was founded in 1971. In 1969, the first meeting of the Working Group for Computer and Verbal, Visual and Sonic Research was held at Utrecht in Netherlands. It was primarily a platform for information exchange. Art historian Johannes van der Wolk, who edited, self-published and distributed 11 newsletters, handled the organization all by himself. Subscribers were considered members in the group, and by 1972, the mailing list comprised 126 subscribers, and he organized 2 symposia that were held in Delft and Amsterdam in 1970. In 1967, the Research Arts Center Technology and Society is founded in Amsterdam. A series of conferences were held at the Museum Fodor in Amsterdam. In 1968, the Research Center co-founder Shebe van Tien, together with Nick Thummers, wrote a manifesto and campaigned against the World Fair Expo 1970 in Osaka that we heard about in previous presentation. Calling for the debate about the functioning of the world fairs in general, and the role of artists, designers, and architects in those undertakings, and called for the resistance to the overall concept. Manifesto was distributed internationally. Dutch architect Piet Blom finally refused the invitation and participated in the World Fair, and didn't participate in the World Fair. Events around the Expo 70 marked a local turning point, dividing Japanese art scene and influencing developments of media arts in Japan. Mashiko Kushara puts these developments into historical and local perspective. Quote, experimental arts and artists and architects were invited to design the major pavilions to showcase latest media technologies. However, Expo was criticized as a festival to draw public attention away from the US-Japan Security Treaty to be renewed in 1970. Avant-garde artists has to make a decision. Some leading artists left Japan and joined Fluxus in New York. Some joined anti-Expo movement. Others stayed and supported the huge success of Expo. It remained the mainstream in the Japanese media art. The collaboration system between artists and industry for Expo became a tradition since then. EAT did not join the criticism, but used the Expo 70 as an opportunity to realize their biggest project, the Pepsi Pavilion. EAT was conceived in 1966 and founded as a non-profit organization by 2 engineers and 2 artists in New York in 1967. Their positive, fairly non-critical, and supportive attitude toward the corporations and industry becomes evident in their statement. EAT has assumed the responsibility of development an effective method for collaboration between artists and engineers with industrial sponsorship. The collaboration of artists and engineers under industrial sanctions emerged as a revolutionary contemporary process. Gustav Metzger from Computer Art Society, UK, commented on the EAT collaboration with industry in 1969. The waves of protest in the States against the manufacturers of war materials should lead EAT to refuse to collaborate with firms producing napalm and bombs for Vietnam. EAT arranged for artists visits to technical laboratories of Bell, IBM, and RCS, and all located in the United States. Also, we heard some nice presentations about those labs in this conference. By 1969, the group had over 2,000 artists and 2,000 engineers members. They implemented a database profiling system to match artists and engineers according to their interest and skills. A technical service program provided artists with access to new technologies by matching them with engineers and scientists for one-on-one collaborations on artist-specific projects. The organization tried to enable artists to directly work with engineers in the very industrial environment in which the technology was developed. Technical services were open to all artists without judgment of the aesthetic value of an artist, project, or idea. EAT operated in the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, and South America, and about 20 local EAT groups were founded all around the world. In 1966, EAT organized 9 evenings, theater and engineering in New York, which involved 10 artists, musicians, and dancers, 30 engineers, and an audience of 10,000. Despite the fact that mostly analog technology did not work properly most of the time, which led to bad publicity, these events gained a reputation of milestones in live technology-based arts. In 1968, EAT participated in the organization of an exhibition, The Machine, as seen at the end of the mechanical age at MoMA, New York, which featured 220 works by artists ranging from Leonardo da Vinci to contemporary ones. EAT proposed a, quote, competition for the best contribution by the engineer to work of art made in collaboration with an artist, end quote. Judging by the panel consisting of engineers only, and organized a related exhibition called Some More Beginnings at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. EAT then went to organize the design of and program the Pepsi Cola Pavilion on Expo 70 in Osaka. 20 artists and 50 engineers and scientists contributed. From 1969 to 1972, EAT, probably after the criticism of taking part in Osaka, also realized a series of socially engaged interdisciplinary projects that made use of user-friendly analog telecommunication system in the United States, India, Japan, Sweden, and El Salvador. Working with indigenous people as well in some of the projects, bringing them technology. So EAT has been an important initiative that, in a constructive and positivist manner, supported collaborations between artists and engineers in a literal sense by bringing them together. As its value system was not artistic or cultural, but a quantitative only, some non-critical projects and unequal collaborations took place next to the successful ones. EAT considered digital technologies as one of the available technologies at a time with no particular focus on them. In a different cultural context, New Tendencies started out as an international exhibition presenting instruction-based, algorithmic, and generative art in Zagreb, Croatia in 1961, and then developed into an international movement and network of artists, gallery owners, art critics, art historians, and theoreticians. Heading to the racialization of art production and conceiving art as a type of research, theoretically framed by people such as Matko Meštrović, Giulio Carlo Aragon, Frank Popper, and Umberto Eco, among others. From 1962 onward, New Tendencies acted as a bottom-up art movement without official headquarters, experimenting with new ways of organization in the form of decision-making system that involved the collective in different organizational forms. Between 1961 and 1973, the Gallery of Contemporary Art, Zagreb, organized 5 exhibitions in Zagreb, and in addition, a large-scale international exhibition were held in Paris, Venice, and Lower Coast. And the one in Venice in '64, the Musée d'Art, the Musée Décoratif, consists of more than 100 artists that show multisensorial installations that was much maybe before once mentioned in about Centre Pompidou 10 years later. So this multimedia stuff. 2 minutes. Oops. Okay. Okay, these guys, so I'm gonna really just jump now. So they were presented, this was a meta network of art groups, among others, from all around the world, United States, Russia, name it, in the Cold War. A picture of the meeting to have an idea, and then in short, I'm really now going to improvise, that the whole idea collapsed when they had an exhibition in MoMA 65, and then when term op art was inaugurated, then these guys just lost the track. I mean, and they start to look at the computers. In 1968, they organized a series of exhibition symposia under the title Computers and Visual Research. That was rather massive, including, as part of the exhibition, these computer-generated light installations since from 1968. They start to publish BIT International magazine from 68 to 72. That's more than 1,000 pages printed of the theory. And they start to make a completely another network after the first one that used analog with computer art only. So we see this is a meta network of more than 100 people involved, so including art groups, artists based in universities, science research centers, theoreticians, corporate research department, and networks. And here we see Jonathan Bentel from Computer Art Society, UK, reading a paper called Zagreb Manifesto, where one network salute another one, and he co-authored this manifesto with Gustav Metzger and Gordon Pask. In 1973, Tendency present another third group of artists, conceptual art, and as such was one of the very few places that present three completely different kinds of groups that did not communicate between each other and respected networks. There was some 70-some magazines published, and Leonardo is the long-lasting one that transgressed the magazine format into the network. And the whole paper will be much extended, published next year in the book Companion to Digital Art, edited by Christiane Paul, as part of Blackwell Companion to Art History. And this is a working version of the cover. Maybe the book will look a little different next year, who knows. Okay, I think I made it within, so really, I mean, I'm kind of like really shorted this into 1 minute, but well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Darko FRITZ. So I see we only have 10 minutes left. I have maybe a general question that I would like to address you, and you feel free to intervene about that. The contexts you've been presenting are all very different. And a thing that I found fascinating is how the body, the human body, there was some animal body somehow, but mostly the human body, have been taking its place within all these processes. And I see the manifestation of the human body with two different declinations. The first is the interaction between the body and the works that have been slowly evolving, especially in your presentation. And in your presentation, we really see that from art, which is more into the apparatus, and then the body of the viewer, which interacts with the works. And Jason and Solvita presentation, also how the body is represented and reimagined and created. And there's circulations of bodies too, because the international network that you've been mentioning have somehow something to do with the way the body would move through the virtual body would move through hyperspace within the project you have been presented. So I don't know who would like maybe to comment on that, how the representation and the situation of the body, the human body, have been evolving through time within the respective cultural practices you've been talking about.
So, okay, by beginning 1962, Umberto Eco made this influential book called Opera Aperta, which basically open work, which theoretically elaborate maybe the most at the time about interaction. That the work is not like artwork, I'm talking about fine art scene. It's not like something that one may adore and just like, but that actually it's open for interaction, and within this interaction, the work actually, it's live, it's open work. So it's actually, and they practiced, it was a very political agenda behind it that was kind of little scale practicing democracy. And with active participation. So, and he elaborates and names several levels of interactions, from the physical involvement to just going around and then when something changed, and so on. But there's one moment, another moment that these artworks have been not necessarily produced by the hand of artists, and they even start to prefer machines producing such an artwork or somebody else. And as in 1973, this exhibition that joined this kind of, let's call it luminokinetic art, and then digital art and as a second category, and conceptual art as a third category. One of the takes they like to make to join all these three rather different art activities was that it's not produced by the author. So, and they all have quite different takes on the rule of the body. Talking about computer art, it's rather different, because in the very beginning it was mostly prints, sometimes light installations. They did have interactive possibilities, like in the case of Vladimir Bonacic, this big one, 36 long on the facade of the building. So there was sometimes some like buttons or some wires that one can interact with. Mostly it was a prints or the films, actually very traditional. And in the third hand, then we have the whole other aspect of that, including body art, and it's completely new paradigm that actually it's still valid today in contemporary art, and still making the big in this dividing so-called media art and contemporary art, because they set up the canons that media art cannot deal with in truly collaborative way. Okay. So there are very different ways how to deal with bodies within the art itself, what he calls for, what some kind of interaction, or within the treatment, how the bodies represent. When I interviewed Michael Knoll, American pioneer of digital art, and he made an exhibit as curator, the first computer-generated ballet. It's like, okay, Mike, because I'm coming from Europe, and when I talk with Nake and Ness all the same time, so they've been like, they talk about Max Bense, information aesthetics. They've been thinking like a year before they dare to do something. And then I met Michael and I said, yeah, I was dating choreographer. We talk about notary system. I've just done it in a day. I was like, but why did you make this? These are random numbers. Does it mean something? No, I just didn't know what to do. I just put these random things here. So, and he done it this way. So this is the computer-generated ballet made this way.
Thank
you. The reason why I focused on the background and the context of media art rather than on artists and artworks was because of my body. When I first rode Jeffrey Shaw's famous bicycle, I felt there is a very strong gap between what I think, what I know about the bicycle, and what I feel the bicycle. And it happens when I teach the students who were born in the 90s these days. So they don't know about the world without internet. And so it was very frustrating for me that I cannot even find the word works and artists without the word at that time. So but I think it's a very good thing for us here, because that's why we need the history view and when we critique works. So the historical view is more needed than any other artistic practices in this field, and that I think it's fascinating.
Thank you. So I'm curious, Jason and Solvita, how can you comment about the evolution of the representation of the body through the corpus of work you've been showing to us today?
Not really. I mean, it's not the way I think about things. So I don't. So I don't. I'm sitting here thinking about it. I'm not sure what I would say about it. So I'd have to get back to you on that. So.
I've been noticing that in the ASCII art there was a lot of representation of faces.
The topic of body in former Soviet Union and in the context of my topic was very, very different. To be very brief, very suppressed, because if Western engineers and computer scientists immediately felt themselves as artists and some pioneers of computer art, but in Soviet Union all engineers were acquainted with this ASCII art, and many of them did it, but no one wanted to reveal that topic, no one wanted to discuss, and no one wanted to makes his or her assignment about it. It's one thing. The second thing about body, these people came from the ordinary engineer and scientist's viewpoint of art, and because of these political restrictions, they mainly knew this realistic mimetic approach, and therefore portraits were escape for them, and ASCII art's nature as at all. But if not, the results may be even not happen, because it is really difficult without any practice and knowledge about drawing to do something in more or less appropriate level of realistic approach, but they didn't know anything else what to deal with the body. It's a very rare example, maybe interesting one, but not with much interaction, body, much models, and these first ASCII pioneers.
So I would just like to add something on this ASCII art. As we know, the reason to make ASCII art, because it was not better printers to do grayscale. That's why they do ASCII. There was no other reason. And some people took that quite inventively. They start to use the symbols instead of characters, so it's not ASCII, but there are something. And one as well was a nude. It's a famous artwork by Manfred Schroeder. And so it was exhibited in the Cybernetic Serendipities all around. But there is one particular case that I found very interesting. It's by the it's work from 1971 from Valdemar Cordeiro, a Brazilian artist, and it was once shown in the first day. I think it was. But what he joined, because to use my lectures, he was one of the very few participants of the educated artists that was taking part in New Tendencies movement on the first analog part and then shifted into the digital one. So he was one who understood art and started to digital, unlike most of the digital art practitioners that really very traditional take on art. Things that nobody likes to say public, but okay, I will say it. These guys really didn't understand art. Unlike these guys, they have these conferences, like really discussing the most radical approaches to art. So Valdemar Cordeiro is one of such, start to use ASCII. And what he made so, it's during Vietnam War, he take a picture of indigenous Vietnamese woman during the Vietnam War, and name it, and I'm afraid that the colleague didn't use that title, but the name of this work, This is Not a BB. This woman, it's not BB. BB refers to Brigitte Bardot. So it's kind of consumeristic approach, it's a gender, it's a political, and it's from artistic point of view, using ASCII, there's this little trick, and Valdemar Cordeiro knew a lot about Gestalt theories because they've been discussing that a lot in previous times about perception of the image. And when you see this work, it's about from what kind of distance you see it. You see more or less it's more or less like blurred, we will see. So, and then he was using that and he made a series of artwork called Individual and Masses. So he knew by the subject what he was dealing about, take a look to the distance, perception of ASCII image, and what's the meaning of it. That's one of the very rare artworks that have all the layers using ASCII imaginary.
Thank you. We have a few extra minutes for a few questions, s'il vous plaît.
Hi, a really interesting panel. Jason, my questions are for you. So I thought one of Skawanati's comments yesterday has an interesting, and again I have two questions, I'm sorry, has an interesting follow-up with your presentation, which is about the kind of relationship to Afrofuturism and the kind of alliances that you see. I mean, it's a big question, but, are there alliances in, kind of developing this kind of indigenous futurism with those histories? And Afrofuturism is really super revitalized right now, as you would know, both aesthetically and in its sort of interventions. And the other is about a kind of global indigenous digital media, new media culture, and, having established a very strong base camp, I suppose, in North America with a lot of this theoretical work. There's so many indigenous communities that are engaging. So whether you see the opportunities on a kind of global level, and I know there's been a kind of history with, New Zealand and Australia with indigenous artists there. So there are two questions, but I think they're somewhat interesting, interlinked.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, good question. So, yeah, there's lots of interesting parallels between the conversations that are going on within sort of Afrofuturism, sort of both the kind of older conversations and the conversations, as you said, right now seem to be re-energized the last, say, 3 or 4 years, 5 years. I think there's a common set of maybe sort of strategies in terms of both thinking about how to reconceptualize the sort of the future imaginary of the settler culture. It's kind of what takes up most of the space, through, everything from imagining sort of colonization going in a different way to imagining how governmental structures would be different. So there's lots of common conversation and language vocabulary that can go on there. There hasn't been a lot. Like, we run into those people from time to time, and we have a great time talking to them. But we haven't actually, that I know of, I haven't seen sort of people working in Afrofuturism and the Indigenous futurism people really coming together. They did a little bit. There was a conference in Hawaii, the one where I met Solomon Enos, that Skawanati I went to, called, this is fantastic, Creating Futures Rooted in Wonder, Connections Between Indigenous Science Fiction, Fantasy, between Indigenous Science Fiction and Fairy Tale Studies. And there was some conversation in there about where those common things might be. Interestingly enough, there's also sort of Chicano futurism, right? And so there are a couple people there who were from a UC Riverside that were involved with that. So I think there's lots of interesting connections that can go on there. I think the big difference, right, is the history, right? And so the history determines what I think we each prioritize about the future. I think certainly within Indigenous futurism, a huge issue is about land and about territory, right? And how can we? Richard Hill writes a great short story that gets at this in the Close Encounters catalog. Basically, so how can we get our land back that doesn't require necessarily killing everybody that presently is on it except for us, right? Interesting question. I'm not necessarily interested in that kind of future. And so the question is, how do you sort of negotiate a language that gets you back to the land in a substantial and significant way, right? But still recognizes the reality of the people who are also here now on this land. So that's a preoccupation with Indigenous futurism, I would say. Preoccupation with Afrofuturism, and I think there's a subset, a significant subset of those things that kind of fall out of similar kinds of ways of looking at it. And then the second thing about the global Indigenous media, both through through Banff and all the programming that happened in Banff, which is and also through the Imaginative Film and Media Festival. We spent a lot of time talking, particularly with Native people from New Zealand and from Australia, now from Polynesia, Hawaii, and part of the goal of the Initiative for Indigenous Futures that Skawanati was talking about yesterday, our sort of new project, is to provide a space to sort of try to pull that international kind of digital media Indigenous crowd in. Though at the same time, Skawanati made a comment yesterday about how, in a very real way, what's happening just within North America is international, right? Because it's nation to nation, right? So it's different Indigenous nations speaking to each other within North America. So that's been happening for a while, but we're very interested in expanding that outward and seeing what they're doing and seeing what kind of dreams they might have. That was so great about seeing Solomon Enos's Polyfantastica work, right? It was just like so different. It was, some things were very similar, but some things were so different from the sorts of things that we think about when we're thinking about Indigenous futurism. So, thanks.
So I see time is running, so I think we'll have to end this session. However, you're welcome to continue the conversation between this presentation and the next one. So thank you very much to all our lecturers and guests.